The moment Texas Governor Greg Abbott leaned into his microphone that Tuesday morning, the entire dynamic of the congressional hearing shifted. The seasoned politician and former Texas Attorney General was there to provide testimony, but what unfolded would redefine the day's headlines. Abbott, known for his sharp intellect and methodical approach to governance, was fully prepared for this exchange. And when he spoke, it became clear to everyone in the room that the balance of authority had just tilted in his direction. Picture this: Committee Room 204 in the Rayburn House office building, packed with cameras, reporters, and lawmakers. The Housing and Urban Development Oversight hearing was expected to be procedural, until Abbott addressed freshman Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett directly. Abbott, dressed in his signature dark suit and crisp tie, projected the steady confidence of a man who has navigated both legal and executive leadership at the highest levels. Understanding the complexities of housing policy, Abbott began, his voice calm but deliberate, requires more than slogans. It requires years of work in law, policy implementation, and real results. I have worked on affordable housing reforms in one of the fastest growing states in the nation. I have navigated federal-state partnerships, litigated housing rights cases, and overseen billions in development funds. These are not theories, these are proven strategies. His gaze fixed briefly on Crockett, not as a personal attack, but as a pointed reminder that policy debates must be grounded in tangible accomplishments. The room grew still. Members leaned forward in their seats, the cameras zoomed in. Abbott continued, detailing his record. As Attorney General, enforcing fair housing laws and defending property rights. As governor, expanding infrastructure and creating programs to increase home ownership among working families. And as a leader who has dealt directly with crises like hurricane recovery housing plans. Some talk about housing policy in the abstract, Abbott said, but in Texas we deliver on it every day. This wasn't arrogance, it was authority backed by decades of public service. And it showed. While some Republican members nodded in approval, even a few Democrats shifted uneasily, recognizing that Abbott's breadth of experience would be difficult to counter with rhetoric alone. Crockett, sitting across the room, seemed momentarily caught off guard by the precision of Abbott's points. She had likely expected a political jab. Instead, she was facing a comprehensive policy case backed by evidence and real-world results. To understand why this moment resonated so strongly, you need to know Abbott's journey. From serving as a justice on the Texas Supreme Court, to defending civil liberties as Attorney General, to leading the second-largest state in the U.S., Abbott's career has been defined by discipline, resilience, and strategic thinking. A man who overcame a life-changing injury in his 20s to build an enduring career in public service, he had long since mastered the art of turning challenges into victories. And on this morning, it was clear. Greg Abbott was not just prepared, he was untouchable. Greg Abbott's decades of public service had already filled more than one biography, but his reputation wasn't built on mere titles. It was forged through results. From his early years as Texas Attorney General to his tenure as governor, Abbott had consistently demonstrated a mastery of policy and governance. His 2014 gubernatorial campaign had been a disciplined, message-driven effort, built on his record of defending constitutional rights, managing crises, and expanding economic opportunity in one of the fastest-growing states in America. Once in office, he navigated natural disasters, spearheaded infrastructure expansion, and negotiated high-stakes federal-state partnerships with a precision that earned him both allies and respect. As governor, Abbott had turned housing policy into a pillar of Texas's growth strategy. He streamlined development regulations to encourage affordable housing projects, defended property rights in landmark legal cases, and launched disaster recovery programs that rebuilt entire communities after hurricanes. He worked directly with local governments to expand access to homeownership for working families, always pairing policy with measurable outcomes. His approach was data-driven, legally sound, and grounded in years of experience. Now in his mid-60s, Abbott was hardly trying to rebuild a political brand. He was reinforcing it. He appeared in the hearing room not as a politician seeking relevance, but as a leader prepared to share hard-earned expertise. Conservative outlets praised his ability to distill complex policy into clear strategies, while even critics acknowledged his unmatched knowledge of housing law, zoning policy, and urban development planning. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, was earning attention for her energetic social media presence and growing national profile. Abbot respected her passion, but knew that passion alone wasn't enough when debating multi-billion-dollar policy issues. His aim wasn't to attack her personally, it was to ensure the public understood that governing requires more than viral clips. It demands years of hands-on experience navigating legislation, budgets, and the real-world impact of lawmaking. Crockett's career had impressive highlights: nearly 2 decades as a civil rights attorney, a strong record in housing discrimination and eviction defense, and legislative service in the Texas House of Representatives. She had represented clients in high-profile housing cases and fought discriminatory zoning laws. Her courtroom victories and policy advocacy were notable, but Abbot knew the gap between advocating for change and implementing it on a statewide scale was vast. In political and legal circles within Texas, Crockett's diligence and preparation were well known. But on the national stage, Abbot understood that perception often outweighed detail. The cameras that morning weren't just capturing a policy debate, they were recording a moment in which experience at the helm of a state government would be measured against years of legal advocacy. Abbot, with his broad perspective and proven results, was ready for that comparison. The stakes of this exchange went far beyond a simple policy disagreement. It was a clash between two very different kinds of political legitimacy: seasoned executive leadership versus rising legislative advocacy. Greg Abbott embodied the weight of proven governance, decades of legal and executive authority, where decisions weren't theoretical but carried real-world consequences for millions of people. His belief was simple: credentials and results, when earned through years of public service, deserve recognition. Across the table sat Jasmine Crockett, representing the newer wave of political figures unafraid to challenge established leaders. Her sharp legal background and unapologetic style resonated with many in her generation. But to Abbott, passion had to be matched with the capacity to implement, manage, and sustain policy outcomes, especially on matters as complex and high stakes as housing and urban development. This particular Housing Committee hearing had drawn unusual attention because of ongoing battles over federal housing programs, budget allocations, and long-term affordability strategies. Conservative outlets had been warning that younger lawmakers sometimes champion proposals without accounting for economic feasibility or long-term execution. Abbott's line of questioning was not meant as a personal insult, but as a reality check, probing whether Crockett's approach was supported by the same depth of experience it took to run statewide housing initiatives under real-world constraints. Abbott's challenge was strategic: highlight the difference between advocating for change in a courtroom and implementing that change at a statewide or federal level, where results depend on budgets, legislation, and bipartisan negotiation. He was not stepping into a trap. He was inviting a conversation on ground he knew well, terrain built on decades of governing and managing the complexities Crockett was now navigating. The atmosphere in Committee Room 2054 shifted noticeably. Abbott's tone was calm, deliberate, and anchored by specifics, and even those unfamiliar with the political dynamics could sense that this was about more than one exchange. It was about the credibility to lead. He leaned forward slightly, his expression steady. "Congresswoman," Abbott began, his voice even and measured, "since you've raised your perspective on housing policy, I think it's important that we discuss the practical realities of implementation. In Texas, we've overseen multi-billion-dollar recovery housing programs, reformed zoning to expand affordable housing, and coordinated with federal agencies to ensure efficiency. These are not abstract debates. They are operational challenges that require more than theory." His delivery wasn't smug, but confident, reinforced by a record that included both legal victories and executive achievements. The chairman, Representative James Clyburn, aware of the growing tension, attempted to steer the conversation back to the text of the housing legislation. But the exchange between Abbott and Crockett had already taken on a life of its own, drawing every lens, microphone, and notepad in the room toward the center of the table. "Perhaps we could return to the substantive policy questions," Chairman Clyburn interjected. But Governor Abbott leaned forward slightly, his tone steady. "Mr. Chairman, I believe this is directly relevant to our housing policy discussion. When questions are raised about the depth of experience guiding these proposals, it's our duty to address them in the open. I welcome the opportunity." The C-SPAN cameras tightened their frame on Abbott, his expression calm, confident, precisely the demeanor of a man used to high-pressure moments in both courtrooms and executive chambers. Political reporters in the gallery were already tapping out first-draft headlines. This was no longer a routine oversight hearing. This was about to become the kind of nationally televised moment that shapes perceptions. Some Republican members on the committee, including Representative Byron Donalds of Florida and Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona, leaned back with the quiet assurance of allies who knew Abbott's track record spoke for itself. He gestured courteously toward Crockett. "Please, by all means, proceed. I'm always interested in understanding the full scope of my colleagues' backgrounds." Abbott's invitation was deliberate. In decades of leadership, he had never needed to hide behind titles. His record in housing recovery after natural disasters, in property rights law, and in expanding affordable housing access for working families was public and undeniable. As Crockett rose, dressed sharply and carrying a manila folder, all eyes in the chamber followed her. "Governor Abbott," she began, "you've stated that expertise matters in housing policy. You're right about that." She held up a document, her law school transcript from Howard University, and emphasized its historical significance. Abbott listened attentively, his expression neutral but engaged, a leader willing to hear credentials laid on the table. Crockett detailed her focus on housing law during her education and her nearly 2 decades litigating housing discrimination, predatory lending, and illegal evictions. The room grew still as she described her courtroom experience. Abbott nodded slightly, acknowledging the weight of her legal record, but he also knew this was only half the story. When she finished, Abbott leaned into the microphone with the calm precision of a man who has navigated countless hearings and negotiations. "Congresswoman, your advocacy record is commendable, but in the realm of policy execution, the challenges extend far beyond litigation. In Texas, I've overseen the allocation of billions in federal housing recovery funds, navigated disaster relief logistics for entire regions, restructured zoning frameworks to spur affordable housing, and coordinated across multiple levels of government to ensure these initiatives reach the people who need them most. These are not legal hypotheticals, they are operational realities. It was the difference between fighting for change and delivering it on a statewide scale, and Abbott made sure everyone in the room understood that distinction. I've won settlements totaling over $12 million for families who were illegally denied mortgages, charged discriminatory rates, or forced from their homes by predatory practices," Crockett stated firmly. Governor Abbott listened intently, his expression neutral but not dismissive. Years of debate and courtroom argument had taught him the value of letting an opponent fully present their case before responding. She continued, outlining her experience arguing Fair Housing Act cases before federal appeals courts, testifying as an expert witness in discrimination trials, and drafting legal briefs that had influenced precedent-setting tenant protection laws. Her record was substantive, and Abbott gave a subtle nod of acknowledgement. But this was not a cross-examination Abbott had walked into unprepared. When she paused, allowing the room to register the weight of her background, the Democratic side of the committee appeared encouraged, while some Republican members shifted in their seats. "Governor Abbott," Crockett continued, turning toward him, "your background in executive leadership is certainly impressive. Running a state like Texas requires immense skill and discipline, but I'm genuinely curious. How much direct legal experience do you have in housing discrimination cases? How many families facing foreclosure have you personally represented? How often have you argued a housing case in federal court?" Abbott leaned slightly forward, his hands folded, and answered without hesitation. "Congresswoman, my role has never been to serve as legal counsel in individual court cases. That's your domain, and I respect it. My expertise lies in ensuring those legal protections you've fought for are actually implemented on a scale that impacts millions. In Texas, I've overseen post-disaster housing recovery that placed tens of thousands of families back into homes, directed statewide compliance with the Fair Housing Act, and coordinated enforcement with our Attorney General's office to hold violators accountable. I've negotiated directly with federal agencies on funding and policy changes that brought billions to Texas communities. That's the practical execution side of the equation. There was no stumble, no falter, only a clear distinction drawn between litigation experience and the operational, legislative, and executive responsibilities of governing. Legal victories are essential, Abbot continued, but so is the capacity to take those principles and scale them so that entire regions benefit, not just individual cases. My qualification to speak here, it is based on decades of translating legal mandates into functioning, funded programs that deliver results to the people who need them most. The silence that followed was different now, not the tense pause of someone cornered, but the measured stillness of a committee recognizing they had just been reminded of the scope of true executive authority. Even some of Crockett's allies took note, realizing this was not an opponent easily diminished. But Jasmine Crockett still wasn't finished. She clearly had one more play prepared, the kind she hoped would end the exchange decisively. From her folder, she slowly pulled another document, holding it with deliberate care. The room's energy shifted. Committee members, staffers, and reporters sensed that she was about to try for a political knockout. "Governor Abbot," she began, her voice steady, "since we are discussing qualifications and expertise, I believe the American people should see one more document." Cameras zoomed in, reporters' fingers hovered over keyboards. Abbott's expression remained composed. Years of courtroom and political battles had taught him the importance of maintaining control in high-pressure moments. As Crockett held up the paper, his staff glanced at one another, knowing their governor would be ready for whatever came next. "This," Crockett announced, "is a transcript of your testimony before the Texas legislature during hearings on statewide housing reform." She paused, clearly expecting a reaction. Abbott leaned back slightly and gestured for her to continue. "In those hearings," Crockett said, "you acknowledged that your role was not as a courtroom litigator in housing law." Abbott nodded. "That's correct, and it's worth repeating for the record," he replied before she could press further. His voice was calm, authoritative. "I have never claimed to be a trial lawyer in housing disputes. My qualification, what has given me the privilege to speak with authority on this matter, is decades of managing and executing housing policy on a statewide scale. I've overseen multi-billion-dollar recovery efforts after disasters, created affordable housing initiatives that have placed tens of thousands of Texans in homes, and implemented zoning reforms to encourage development where it's needed most. I've negotiated directly with federal officials and navigated both legislative and budgetary hurdles to make those projects happen. That is the expertise required to lead in this field." The effect was immediate. By taking control of the moment instead of being rattled, Abbott reframed Crockett's gotcha as proof of his executive clarity. He had always drawn the distinction between legal advocacy and governing execution. Crockett hesitated, the weight of the governor's rebuttal settling over the room. Reporters who had prepared to write about a political takedown now found themselves capturing a different kind of headline, one about a leader turning an attempted attack into a reaffirmation of his authority. Abbott leaned forward, closing the loop with deliberate precision. "Congresswoman, housing policy is not won in a single courtroom. It is delivered in every neighborhood, every rebuilt community, every family given a home after a disaster. That is my record, and that is why I am here today." In that moment, the soundbite that would be replayed on news programs wasn't Crockett's reveal. It was Abbott's calm, unshakable statement, a reminder that leadership is measured not only by what you know, but by what you can deliver. "Governor Abbott," Crockett pressed, "you may have decades of executive leadership, but I've fought for families in housing courtrooms my entire career. That's real expertise, not sitting in boardrooms implementing policies." The room rippled with reaction. Democrats applauding, some Republicans shifting forward, anticipating Abbott's response. Reporters were already preparing their headlines, but Abbott didn't flinch. He waited for the noise to subside, then leaned into his microphone with the composure of a man who'd faced high-stakes situations countless times before. "Congresswoman," Abbott began, his tone steady but firm, "I respect your dedication to housing litigation. But leadership at the state and national level is not about winning a single case. It's about shaping policy so that millions of families never have to go to court in the first place. My role has been to prevent the harm you've had to fight after the fact." The room quieted as Abbott continued, drawing on concrete examples. "After Hurricane Harvey, my administration mobilized billions in housing recovery for Texans. We overhauled zoning laws to spur affordable housing development and enforced the Fair Housing Act through coordinated action between state and federal agencies. I've negotiated directly with HUD to secure resources and implemented programs that rebuilt entire communities, not in theory, but in reality. That is why I'm qualified to speak here today. There was no hesitation, no defensive edge, only an unshakable confidence built on decades of proven results. Even some of Crockett's allies were now scribbling notes, aware that Abbot had effectively reframed the entire exchange. He closed with the kind of line that news outlets would replay on loop. Congresswoman, experience comes in many forms. Yours has been in the courtroom. Mine has been in ensuring laws work on the ground in every neighborhood, every rebuilt home, every family kept from losing everything. That's not theory, that's governance. And it's why I would never apologize for the work we've done to make housing accessible in Texas. Chairman Clyburn called for a recess, but the tone in the room had shifted. Abbot gathered his papers with calm precision, staffers surrounding him not in damage control, but in quiet acknowledgement that their governor had just taken an attempted attack and turned it into a masterclass in political composure. By the time the hearing clips began circulating online, the narrative wasn't about a leader being destroyed. It was about a governor defending his record with clarity, facts, and an undeniable command of the issues. Within 15 minutes of the hearing's recess, #AbbotDefendsRecord was trending at the top of Twitter worldwide. Social media platforms scrambled to keep up with the surge of clips, commentary, and discussion pouring in. The first widely shared video appeared at 11:52 a.m., posted by a political journalist who had been watching live. It was 90 seconds of Governor Abbot calmly dismantling a line of attack with concrete policy achievements, followed by his closing statement that drew on a clear line between advocacy and statewide execution. Within 2 hours, that single post had been retweeted over 150,000 times and viewed more than 3 million times. Supporters across the political spectrum praised Abbott's composure and the clarity of his answers. Representative Byron Donalds shared the video with the caption, "Experience matters, and this is what it looks like." Senator Tim Scott tweeted, "Policy is about results. Abbott reminded everyone today why he's one of the most capable leaders in the country." The memes came quickly, but they worked in Abbott's favor. One widely shared image showed him leaning forward at the mic, captioned, "Facts, Soundbites." Another split-screen meme contrasted Abbott touring a hurricane recovery site in Texas with the quote, "Leadership is more than a courtroom. It's rebuilding communities." On TikTok, a viral edit paired his key lines with footage of Texas housing projects being completed, earning 2.8 million views in 12 hours. Progressive commentators were less enthusiastic, but even some acknowledged that Abbott had stayed unshaken under pressure. Attempts to portray his housing record negatively ran into a wall of documented recovery programs, affordable housing expansions, and bipartisan initiatives he had led as governor. Cable news networks devoted segments to the exchange, with coverage varying by outlet, but all agreeing on one point. Abbott had used the moment to reinforce his policy credentials. CNN's headline read, "Governor Abbott turns challenge into policy masterclass." MSNBC opened with, "Experience meets the moment. Abbott's confident response draws national attention." Even Fox News ran multiple replay clips of Abbott's closing statement, framing it as the definitive answer on housing policy experience. On CNN's The Situation Room, political analyst Van Jones commented, "Crockett came prepared, but Abbott wasn't rattled. He reframed the discussion into one about results, not just rhetoric. That's seasoned politics." Conservative commentator Scott Jennings added, "You saw the difference today between someone who's argued cases and someone who's delivered results at scale." Abbott made that contrast very clear. On MSNBC, Joy Reid admitted, "This wasn't the exchange some expected. Abbott had stayed calm, had receipts of his own, and knew how to steer the conversation back to what he's done in office. That's why the clip is getting so much traction." Governor Abbott once again demonstrated that leadership titles mean little without the substance to back them up. Only in this case, his decades of results left no doubt that he belonged in the conversation. Behind the scenes, the political ripples were immediate. Republican leadership was quietly pleased, noting that Abbott had handled the hearing without theatrics, kept the focus on policy, and avoided falling into the trap of personal attacks. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy publicly remarked, "It's refreshing to see a policy debate stay centered on solutions rather than sound bites." Even some Democratic leaders, while politically opposed to Abbott's policies, privately acknowledged that he had kept his composure and used the exchange to highlight his housing record. One senior Democratic staffer told a reporter off the record, "He didn't give us the viral gotcha moment we were hoping for." The White House press briefing the next day reflected a similar tone. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, when asked about the exchange, said with a measured smile, "The president believes housing policy is a serious matter, and we encourage all leaders, regardless of party, to bring their experience and ideas to the table." Governor Abbot clearly came prepared. Abbott's communications team moved swiftly to capitalize on the positive momentum. By 4 p.m., they had released a highlights reel of his hearing remarks, intercut with footage of completed Texas housing developments, disaster recovery projects, and bipartisan bill signings. The video was picked up by local Texas stations and shared widely on social media under the hashtag #ResultsMatter, trending regionally within hours. The next day, Abbott appeared on Sean Hannity's radio show. Hannity introduced the segment by saying, "Governor, I think you surprised a lot of people yesterday, turning a challenge into a showcase for your record." Abbott responded with his signature calm, "Sean, it's not about winning an exchange. It's about making sure people understand the work that goes into these policies. My job is to deliver results, not just arguments." The interview drew praise from conservative commentators and even a few neutral analysts who noted that Abbott had maintained control of the narrative. Meanwhile, Crockett continued her media tour, but much of the coverage framed the exchange as a policy contrast rather than a personal victory. By week's end, Abbott's staff had fielded multiple invitations for him to speak on national housing policy panels, including one hosted by a bipartisan think tank in Washington. Far from damaging his standing, the hearing had reminded both allies and critics why Greg Abbott's name consistently surfaced in conversations about higher office. He was steady, prepared, and unshaken in the face of challenge. Governor Abbot understood the value of letting the record speak for itself, and in this case, his own documented history worked in his favor. The audience reacted with sustained applause as Abbott used the opportunity to pivot seamlessly from the exchange into his broader housing policy agenda. In every interview afterward, he strategically returned the conversation to substance. His administration's work expanding affordable housing initiatives, combating predatory lending practices, and spearheading large-scale disaster recovery programs. This was never about personal sparring or political theater, Abbott told Anderson Cooper on CNN. It's about showing the American people that leadership means having the experience to turn ideas into results. Housing policy affects millions of families, and those families deserve leaders who've been responsible for delivering programs that work, not just talking points. The Abbott-Crockett hearing became a defining moment for both politicians, but in very different ways than some expected. For Abbott, it solidified his reputation as a calm, policy-driven leader who could withstand scrutiny and keep the conversation centered on solutions. Conservative media outlets replayed his remarks as an example of measured political debate, while even some neutral commentators acknowledged the strength of his performance. His speaking invitations to national policy forums increased, as did his presence in bipartisan housing and infrastructure panels. When Abbott later weighed in on federal education and infrastructure policy, his comments carried more weight. Audiences and interviewers now associated him with a proven record of executive leadership. Supporters pointed to the hearing as evidence of how to maintain composure while under direct challenge, and to emerge with the narrative in your favor. For Crockett, the moment still brought visibility, but the exchange also underscored the difficulty of challenging a political figure with decades of governance experience and concrete results. While her advocacy work continued, some potential challengers in Texas politics became more cautious, recognizing that Abbott's ability to counterattack with facts and achievements made him a formidable opponent. In political science classrooms, the exchange began appearing as a case study in the difference between advocacy credentials and governing credentials, and how each can be framed effectively. Communication experts dissected Abbott's ability to remain steady, avoid personal attacks, and redirect every question back to policy implementation and measurable outcomes. The moment also became a rallying point for those who valued executive experience, the ability to oversee large-scale programs, coordinate with multiple agencies, and deliver tangible results to communities. The term Abbott moment began circulating among political commentators as shorthand for taking a potential political challenge and turning it into an opportunity to reinforce one's authority and competence in real time. Months later, the Abbot-Crockett exchange was still generating discussion and analysis. YouTube compilations of political masterclasses often featured Abbott's poised, fact-driven responses, and political TikTok creators used audio from the hearing to illustrate how to stay composed under pressure and redirect the conversation back to substance. Academic articles cited the hearing as an example of how to maintain authority in the face of pointed challenges, turning potential gotcha moments into opportunities to showcase expertise. The exchange subtly shifted the tone of future congressional hearings. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle became more careful about questioning colleagues' qualifications, recognizing that a calm, well-prepared response, like Abbott's, could flip the script in real time. Abbott hadn't intended to embarrass anyone. His goal had been to ground the discussion in the realities of policy implementation. In the process, he reminded viewers that political authority should rest on the ability to deliver measurable results. Rather than diminish his influence, the hearing elevated Abbott's profile in the national conversation on housing and governance. Policy forums, think tanks, and bipartisan committees sought his input more frequently. Media appearances highlighted not just the exchange itself, but the fact that Abbott used it to pivot toward his legislative achievements: post-disaster housing recovery, affordable housing expansion, and statewide zoning reform. For Crockett, the moment still brought a surge of attention, but Abbott's steady handling of the situation meant she never walked away with an uncontested win in the public eye. The debate became a case study in how competing types of expertise, legal advocacy versus executive governance, can both command respect. Political science professors used the hearing to contrast advocacy skill with policy execution, and communication experts dissected Abbott's method: staying calm, never taking the bait for personal attacks, and grounding every response in documented outcomes rather than hypotheticals. The lesson that emerged for politicians was clear: preparation is key, but so is knowing your own strengths and how to present them. Abbott had come to that hearing ready with facts, figures, and real-world examples. His preparation allowed him to answer challenges without defensiveness, to stay focused on his message, and to leave the room with his credibility not just intact, but strengthened. For young professionals watching, especially those who valued substance over spectacle, Abbott's performance reinforced that the best defense against being underestimated is a clear record of results. The most effective way to respond to doubt is to demonstrate, with precision, what you've accomplished. In the end, the Abbot-Crockett hearing was remembered not as a moment of political humiliation, but as an example of how experience, preparation, and composure can turn even a pointed challenge into a showcase for leadership. Abbott had shown that in politics, as in governance, the real measure of expertise is not in titles or rhetoric, it's in the results you deliver. And on that day, he made certain everyone in the room and millions watching from home understood exactly what that looked like.